Commander Togo Yashimoto was a strict disciplinarian whose views were well known. The survival of I-357 and all who served in her hung upon a slender thread of vigilance. Conversation unrelated to duty diminished vigilance. For these reasons it was, as he emphasized in his standing order book, a most serious breach of discipline. A breeze off the land did something to relieve the torpor of the night, bringing with it the musky, spice-laden odours of tropical Africa. To Yashimoto the smell was a pleasant one, redolent of the Straits of Malacca, waters he knew well, for the submarine was based on Penang, 4,500 miles to the northeast. Unless the unforeseen happened, he hoped to be back there by mid-December. That was a little less than a month away. Penang promised several weeks of unbroken nights, freedom from the stress of danger, regular baths, daily shaves, clean clothes, good food and drink with fresh fruit and vegetables, the company of brother officers of his own seniority, and the comfort of Masna's warm thighs, her pleasant chatter and other tender attentions. There would, too, be letters, mostly from his wife in Kure with family news. Indeed, there was much to look forward to. Pleasant as these thoughts were, they were soon displaced by others of a graver nature. They concerned a problem which had nagged at him for days. And now, as he settled his forearms on the bridge screen to steady the binoculars with which he searched the darkness, the problem once again began to fill his mind. Before dealing with it, however, there was a matter of routine to be attended to. "Time of sunrise?" he asked, without lowering the binoculars. Fitted with high-resolution night lenses, they were standard issue for the Japanese submarine service. 5:26, sir," replied the officer who stood beside him on the bridge. Ito Kagumi was not only officer of the watch, but I-357's first lieutenant. Ichiro Noguchi, the acting sub-lieutenant on watch with him, had twitched involuntarily at the captain's question. It was a trap. Yashimoto would have known the time of sunrise before reaching the bridge. The times of setting and rising of the sun and moon were shown on a slate above the chart table. Lieutenant Sato, the navigating officer, chalked them up each morning before going on watch. Yashimoto never failed to look at the chart and slate before coming to the bridge, nor did he ever fail to make this ritual check with the officer of the watch, and woe betide any who got it wrong. Noguchi had done so on the first few days of the patrol. "Submarines dive at dawn," Yashimoto had barked, the frozen stare terrifying the unfortunate Noguchi. "They dive because daylight is an even greater danger than incompetent officers. To know the time of sunrise is essential to survival." The captain's short, thick-set body had stiffened, the lower lip jutting aggressively. "You will, therefore, at noon each day for the next 3 weeks, give me in writing the times of rising and setting of the sun and moon." Yashimoto lowered his binoculars and moved towards the after end of the conning tower, checking as he went that the lookouts had their night glasses trained on the sectors allocated to them. He felt his way past the periscope standards, reached the anti-aircraft gun platform abaft the conning tower, steadied himself against its guardrail, and searched astern with binoculars. His mind was not so much concerned with what might be out there in the darkness as with the problem he had tussled with over the last few days. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that there was only one solution. Outbursts of hysteria in the control room could under exceptional circumstances be tolerated, though they were bad for morale and threatened the safety of the submarine. But hysteria, while I-357 was under attack, coupled with physical interference with men carrying out their duties at the controls, was an offence of the gravest nature. The young reservist, fresh out of Tokyo University, should never have been drafted into the submarine service. Nor would he have been, reflected Yashimoto, but for the influence of an uncle, a rear admiral, who had distinguished himself in submarines. Yashimoto was a career officer steeped in the samurai tradition, the son and grandson of naval officers, all men of the samurai caste. In 1905 his father had fought at the Battle of Tsushima Strait, the greatest sea engagement in the history of naval warfare. In that battle the Japanese fleet, commanded by Admiral Togo, had sunk 6 of the 8 Russian battleships, captured 2, and sunk or captured most of the remaining ships of the Russian fleet. This for the loss of 3 Japanese torpedo boats. Against more than 11,000 Russians, dead or captured, the Japanese had lost 117 men. Yashimoto's father had served on Admiral Togo's staff at Tsushima and had in due course given his son the prestigious first name of Togo. Yashimoto's upbringing and naval training had been dominated by this background. Bushido, the way of the warrior, had been evolved by the samurai. Loyalty, honor, discipline were the foundations of the warrior code, one which had been fundamental to Japanese naval tradition since the days of the Shimazu warships of the 17th century. Standing by the guardrail with these thoughts in mind, he decided that for the honor of the Imperial Japanese Navy, for his own honor, and no less for that of the guilty man, he must bring the matter to a conclusion. For him, it had been a painful surprise that the offender had shown himself to be no samurai. It was the failure of the young man to commit seppuku, the implicit admission that he lacked the courage to purge dishonor with that ritual act of disembowelment which had created Yashimoto's problem. He sighed, shook his head, and looked at the luminous dial of his wristwatch. The first pale shades of dawn were showing in the eastern sky. It was time to return to the bridge. On reaching it, he spoke to Kagumi. "We will be diving in 10 minutes. Carry on below. I will take her down." With a brief, "Yes, sir," the first lieutenant lowered himself into the hatch and descended the conning tower ladder. Yashimoto put down the binoculars with which he had been examining the still dark horizon. Turning to Noguchi, he said, "Time of sunrise, Sub-Lieutenant." 5:26, sir." "Good." Yashimoto nodded approvingly, paused. "I was on the anti-aircraft gun platform a moment ago. There is something knocking against the hull, aft on the port side. Not loud. Possibly a piece of rope or wire caught in a vent. The light is getting stronger. Go along the casing and check. We will be diving soon, so look smart about it." In a more kindly tone, he added, "Keep a hand on the guard wire as you go. We do not want a man overboard." Noguchi had replied with a submissive, "Yes, sir." He made his way aft, past the periscope standards, onto the anti-aircraft gun platform and down the ladder to the steel casing. With a hand on the guard wire, he moved cautiously towards the stern. He disliked going out on the casing at any time. It always seemed dangerous to him, even when the sea was as smooth as it was now. So he walked slowly, apprehensively, along the steel casing, the bulging ballast tanks beneath him shining wetly in the half-light, the sea lapping and gurgling along their tops. He passed the engine room, the vibrations of the diesels now stronger, reached the after end of the casing and stopped. With one hand on the guard wire stanchion, he leant over the port side. There was nothing to be seen projecting from the vents, nor could he hear the knocking sound the captain had complained of. Still kneeling, anxious not to give the captain the impression that he had skimped the job, he heard the raucous blare of the klaxon. He jumped up, slipped, but still holding the stanchion, pulled himself to his feet, and in the faint light of early morning stared in dismay at the distant blur of the conning tower. It was only seconds since the klaxon had begun to sound, but the sharp hiss of air from the vents as the ballast tanks flooded, the cessation of noise and vibration from the diesels as the electric motors took over, and the increasingly bows-down angle of I-357 brought home to him the reality of what was happening. Terrified, he began a frenzied scramble for the conning tower, screaming, "Wait! Wait!" As he went, he reached the ladder to the anti-aircraft gun platform, clawed his way up it, the sea foaming and splashing at his feet. Still screaming, he made a rush for the conning tower hatch between the periscope standards. With awful disbelief, he saw that the upper lid was already shut. He was hammering with his fists on its solid top when seas flooding the bridge carried him away. Soon after Noguchi embarked on his journey along the casing, Yashimoto had moved to the foreside of the bridge, put his binoculars to his eyes, and begun once again to search the fading darkness. His sudden exclamation of surprise was followed by an urgent, "Listen." He gestured towards the port bow. "Aircraft!" he shouted suddenly, pressing the klaxon button for a crash dive and ordering the lookouts to clear the bridge. With the speed and precision of long practice, they dropped into the upper hatch and scrambled down the conning tower ladders. Having shut the voice pipes, Yashimoto followed, slamming to the upper hatch above his head and ramming home the safety clips before going down the ladder into the control room. The forward hydroplanes were already pulling the bows down, the rate of dive increasing, the ballast tanks flooding, and the sharp hiss of air escaping from them masking other sounds. "Shut the lower hatch," he ordered as he landed on the control room deck. "Take her down to 75 meters. 75 meters, repeated the first lieutenant from his station behind the plainsmen. Though his eyes were on the clicking needles of the depth gauges, he was wondering why I-357's search receiver had failed to detect the aircraft. Yashimoto picked up the phone to the engine room. It was answered by the chief engineer officer, Susuma Satogawa. "Air attack." Yashimoto's voice was sharp. "Shut off for depth charging." He replaced the phone, knowing that his cryptic order would suffice for both the engine room and those in the control room, among them the yeoman of signals who at once passed the message to the men in the fore and after ends. The thud of heavy watertight doors closing was magnified by the relative silence which had followed the shutting down of the diesels and the switch to electric motors. It was broken now by the first lieutenant's report. 75 meters, sir. Hold her there. Silent running. Revolutions for 2 knots. Steer 085. Yashimoto's voice was calm, unemotional. That was something the crew found reassuring. They were, with few exceptions, young men for whom strong leadership was of special significance. In 357, ventilating and air conditioning fans were switched off, the only sounds the faint hum of electric motors at low speed, the subdued voices of men giving and acknowledging orders, and the whir and click of instruments. The bows-down angle of the dive gave way to a level trim. At 2 knots, the plainsmen were just able to hold the trim. The new course, 85 degrees, was 90 degrees to starboard of that which the submarine had been steering before the dive. The first lieutenant knew that Yashimoto had ordered silent running in case the aircraft dropped a sonar buoy. The Americans had begun using them in the Pacific. Perhaps the Royal Air Force flying boats based on Kilindini already had them. Yashimoto leant against the conning tower ladder, alert but apparently relaxed, a comforting figure to those in the cramped confines of the control room with its maze of pipes, valves, controls and labyrinth of instruments, a technological Aladdin's cave where dim red lights cast strange shadows on tense, unshaven faces, which constantly glanced upwards, listening fearfully for the splash of depth charges striking the surface before sinking towards I-357 as she moved slowly through the darkness of deep water. Yashimoto knew what his men were thinking, that at any moment there would be violent explosions which would buffet the submarine with massive blows, rocking the control room, splintering light bulbs and gauge glasses, water spurting from fractured pipes, short-circuited cables flashing and crackling, the sulphurous smell of burning insulation compounding the ever-present stench of diesel oil, the terrifying noise and chaos of a depth-charge attack like the one they had experienced a few days before. But as seconds became minutes, and minutes more minutes, nothing happened, and gaunt expressions of fear gave way to grins of relief, to eyes which exchanged unspoken messages of congratulation. At last the captain broke the silence. They could not have sighted us. The crash dive was well executed. I heard the aircraft to port, flying low it seemed. It must have been the morning reconnaissance from Pamanzi or Kilindini. 2 ratings who had been on bridge lookout when the klaxon sounded exchanged imperceptible shakes of the head. They had not heard the aircraft, nor had Yashimoto, for the good reason that there had not been one. The only sound he had heard was a faint scream from the anti-aircraft gun platform as he shut the upper hatch. The unspoken question in many minds was voiced at last by the first lieutenant. "Ichiro Noguchi, Captain?" Yashimoto bowed, gestured solemnly with his hands. "He was on the aftercasing, investigating a peculiar knocking I had heard earlier. When the crash dive came, he did not reach the upper hatch." Yashimoto spoke without emotion, his face impassive. He chose the way of honour. The first lieutenant's eyes fixed the captain's. "It is better so, Captain." To those in the control room who had so recently witnessed Noguchi's disgrace, his end had come as no surprise. Before long, I-357 was back on her northbound course, making good 6 knots at a depth of 25 meters since there was still insufficient light for periscope observations. Watch diving routine had been resumed, and most of the men off watch had taken to their bunks. In his cabin, it was a small affair with little more than a bunk, a desk, a diminutive settee, and a wash basin with jugged water. Yashimoto was drafting a brief report on the loss overboard of acting Sub-Lieutenant Noguchi. Not only would it form an entry in the submarine's logbook, but when I-357 reached Penang, he intended sending a copy to Rear Admiral Noguchi, the sub-lieutenant's uncle. He would send it to the admiral under cover of a personal letter, conveying his most sincere condolences and extolling the officer-like qualities of Ichiro Noguchi, one-time philosophy student at the University of Tokyo. For these reasons, he was attentive to detail in composing the entry. It was important that it should read well. Having completed the task, he made his obeisances before the small Shinto shrine mounted on the forward bulkhead of his cabin, commending the soul of Noguchi to the good offices of his ancestors. It had been an uneventful day. No sightings on the various occasions that I-357 had come to periscope depth, no reports from the hydrophone operators of propeller noises or echoes, nothing but the rhythmic hum of the electric motors, the whir of ventilating fans, and at times the voices of men. In late afternoon, having rested, Yashimoto went to the chart table where the submarine's position was plotted at hourly intervals. With dividers, he measured off the distance covered since the 1700 position. The submarine's course of 355 degrees ran parallel to the Mozambique coast, distant on average some 25 miles to port apart from a string of small islands, which lay several miles offshore. For several reasons, he had chosen to keep within reasonable distance of the land, rather than well out in the broad reaches of the Mozambique Channel. There was plenty of deep water along the coast, much of it 2,000 meters and more. Merchant ships tended to stay inshore because the British believed it made them safer from submarine attack, and, most importantly, the light at Cape Delgado, close on 100 miles ahead, was a focal point for both north and southbound shipping. Running on the surface, I-357 would be off Cape Delgado soon after midnight. Yashimoto had hopes of a target thereabouts, preferably a vessel sailing alone. He was not anxious to tangle again with an escorted convoy. I-357's recent encounter with one had very nearly ended in disaster. As it was, he feared that I-362 might have been lost for her commanding officer. Lieutenant Commander Suzuki had made no report since that action. I-362 had been placed under Yashimoto's command when they left Penang with orders to attack merchant shipping in the Mozambique Channel. Earlier in the year, Rear Admiral Ishikaze, with 5 boats of the 8th Submarine Flotilla, had carried out a highly successful operation in the Mozambique Channel, sinking over 120,000 tons of merchant shipping and crippling the British battleship Ramillies. But, as Yashimoto well knew, conditions in the Channel were now very different. Ishikaze had enjoyed the advantage of 2 armed supply ships, of enemy merchant ships sailing unaccompanied, and the virtual absence of enemy destroyers and other anti-submarine forces, notably aircraft. Yashimoto, with only 2 submarines under his command, no supply ships and a base plus or minus 5,000 miles away, had to operate against well-escorted convoys, patrolling destroyers, and constant surveillance from the air. And since few ships now sailed unaccompanied, easy targets were difficult to find. Yashimoto, a keen and efficient naval officer, found it hard to accept that during the 7 weeks since leaving base, his 2 submarines had sunk only 4 vessels, one of these a coaster off the Chagos Islands, on the long outward passage from Penang. Thus, the Mozambique operation had yielded only 3 sinkings so far, no more than 17,000 tons, and I-357 was already homeward bound. Looking at the slate above the chart table, he saw that sunset was at 1806, moonrise 2034. The clock next to it showed 1801. There was little twilight in the tropics, for the darkness of night soon followed the setting of the sun. The last time I-357 had been at periscope depth, Yashimoto had seen storm clouds in the northwestern sky. That was where the weather came from. It might be a dark night despite the moon. He decided to surface at about 7:30 p.m. Yashimoto took I-357 to periscope depth at 19:30. After a thorough check of the screen of darkness around the submarine and assurances from the hydrophone operator that there were no propeller noises, he ordered, "Down periscope, surface." The first lieutenant gave the surfacing orders. The lower hatch was opened by a petty officer, and Yashimoto climbed up the conning tower ladders, followed by the lookouts. He eased the safety clips on the upper hatch. When the noise of seas buffeting the bridge ceased, he released the clips, pressure within the submarine then forcing the hatch lid open. Hauling himself clear of the conning tower, he stepped onto the bridge where the last vestiges of seawater were still draining away. Savouring the fresh night air, so welcome after the stale atmosphere below with its odours of diesel, battery gas, human bodies and decaying food, he and the lookouts began probing the darkness with binoculars. Behind the periscope standards, the search aerial was turning in its perpetual vigil. Satisfied that all was well, Yashimoto gave the order for the diesels to be started. Charging of the batteries began, air compressors were switched on, and he gave the order for normal patrol routine. It was his custom at night to remain on the bridge with the officer of the watch for the first hour after surfacing. He did this, too, for the hour before the dawn dive. The sea was calm, its surface still only ruffled by the offshore breeze. Under an overcast sky, I-357 slipped through the water at 12 knots, her bows dipping and rising to the undulations of the southeasterly swell. To the officer of the watch. Lieutenant Toshida, the captain, appeared to be in unusually good spirits, certainly more communicative than he had been for some time. For his part, Yashimoto was pleased with the weather, for if the sky remained overcast, it boded well for the night. Moreover, he was glad of the company of Toshida, his gunnery officer, a zealous and capable young man for whom he had a high regard. Having remarked that the darkness of the night was accentuated by the banks of cloud which obscured most of the normally starlit southern sky, Yashimoto added, "Time of moonrise. Lieutenant? 20:34, sir. Good. Possibly the clouds will hide it." "Yes, sir," replied Toshida quietly. One did not disagree with the captain, even if one had doubts. Not that Toshida had. He disliked the moon, but his thoughts at that moment happened to be in Matsuyama, on the shores of the inland sea. There his wife was expecting their first child. It might already have arrived. Boy or girl? Had it been a safe delivery? Was she well? He would not know until I-357 reached Penang. The uncertainty troubled him. Once more he raised his binoculars in the endless search. The voice pipe buzzer sounded. It was the chief telegraphist, Petty Officer Keda, reporting the receipt of a signal from Penang. The navigating officer was, he said, putting it through the cipher machine. Yashimoto at once announced that he would go down to the control room. The signal from the flag officer Submarines Penang brought such a pronounced wrinkle to the captain's forehead that men in the control room wondered what it was about, particularly when he went to the chart table with Lieutenant Sato, opened the folio drawer, took from it a fresh chart and placed it over the one already on the table. The Penang signal informed Yashimoto that a damaged British aircraft carrier with 2 escorting destroyers had passed through the Suez Canal on passage to Durban for refit and repairs. The carrier and its escorts would call at Mombasa to refuel on the journey south, arriving there sometime on November 26th or 27th. I-357 and I-362 were to take station off that port not later than midnight on November 25th. The chief telegraphist had not yet heard I-362 acknowledge the signal, reported the navigating officer. Yashimoto looked up from the chart table, the doubt in his narrowed eyes underlined by dark pouches beneath them. "That is bad news, Lieutenant, coming on top of I-362's continued failure to report since the convoy attack. Well, this is war, but we shall carry out the attack." The navigating officer's "yes, sir" was unenthusiastic. He had a considerable respect for British destroyers after their recent encounter. Closing his mind to that unpleasant recollection, he listened instead to the captain thinking aloud as he worked on the chart with dividers and a slide rule. Distance to Mombasa, 485 miles. At 12 knots surfaced and 6 submerged, we make good 216 miles in 24 hours. So passage to Mombasa will be 54 hours. It is now 2015 on November 20th. We have time in hand. He had worked on I-357's economical speeds. The big 1,600-ton submarine was capable of 21 knots on the surface and 9 knots submerged. "Current, sir," began Sato. "I am aware of the current," interrupted Yashimoto with a slight show of annoyance. 3 knots south-going in the Mozambique Channel, but there is often a counter-current inshore." "Yes, sir, of course." Sato was now apologetic. "I only mentioned the current because you thought I'd forgotten it." Yashimoto looked up from the chart, bared his teeth at the young lieutenant in a humourless smile. "Inshore is where I intend to go." The captain's aggressive intentions were mirrored by the outward thrust of his lower lip. "Alter course 25 degrees to port. Let me know when we are within 5 miles of the land. Then give me a course for Cape Delgado." Yashimoto turned away from the chart table, looked round the control room and nodded briefly to the men near him before making his way to the conning tower ladder. There, he found Lieutenant Torago Nangi, the torpedo officer, who had taken over from Toshida when the watches changed at 20. In the northwest there were distant flashes of lightning, followed by faint rumbles of thunder. These did not concern Yashimoto unduly as he looked into the darkness. Indeed, thinking about the Penang signal, his earlier sense of well-being became one of near elation. Having disposed of the problem of Ichiro Noguchi in more senses than one, and being free of worry on that account, he was able to give his mind wholeheartedly to what lay ahead. Not only was I-357 homeward bound, but the Penang signal had banished any fear that she might not find a target before reaching her base. There was certainly a target now, only 5 days away, and what a target! An aircraft carrier, the dream of every submarine commander. The escort, 2 destroyers. Pity about I-362, thought Yashimoto. That could have made things easier. But an arrogant sense of self-sufficiency brushed the difficulty aside. Earlier in the year, off the Marshall Islands, he had sunk an American destroyer and seriously damaged the heavy cruiser it was escorting in company with another destroyer. That attack had been carried out by I-357 operating alone. He was more than ready to meet the new challenge. It was fortunate, he reminded himself, that I-357 had 6 torpedoes remaining. Since leaving Penang, the expenditure of torpedoes in relation to sinkings had been high, but in a number of instances this had been due to faulty running, technical failures in the weapons themselves. His thoughts went on. There was deep water outside the entrance to Kilindini, the port of Mombasa. That would be in I-357's favour. The enemy's time of arrival off the port was an important factor. If it were during the hours of darkness, so much the better. He preferred a night action. There would be 2 opportunities for attack, the arrival of the carrier and its escorts and their departure. If conditions did not favour the former, he could fall back on the latter. That might in any event be advisable since, on the enemy's arrival, he would have observed the carrier's course when approaching the port. If there was a British minefield, she and her escorts would keep to the swept channel. He was busy with these tactical problems when the voice pipe buzzer sounded. "Hydrophone cabinet, bridge. Propeller noises on sector red 30 to 40, sir. Range 5,000 yards. Single screw, slow revolutions, closing slowly." It was the operator on watch reporting from the hydrophone cabinet. Yashimoto's mind worked fast. 2.5 nautical miles, it told him. Range closing slowly, with I-357 doing 12 knots. So they were overtaking a northbound vessel. Single screw, slow revolutions, a merchant ship. He called the control room. The first lieutenant answered. "Pass the word for action, standby." Yashimoto's voice had hardened. "Surface action. Have the gun's crew ready. Tell Lieutenant Toshida I want him up here." Yashimoto had not used the action alarm for fear that its raucous clamour might carry down wind to the target. For the same reason he frowned at the sounds of unusual activity, which drifted up through the conning tower as men below hurried to their stations. Toshida arrived on the bridge, followed by the coxswain who took over the upper steering position. Yashimoto had already altered course to put the target vessel directly ahead. In the control room, the navigating officer recorded the time in the action log, 20:31. During the next 20 minutes, the thunderstorm in the northwest drew nearer, and the range of the ship ahead dropped steadily. By the time it was down to 2,000 yards, reports from the hydrophone operator confirmed Yashimoto's belief that the target was a merchant ship. Making good 10 knots, it was on course for Cape Delgado, 95 miles distant. The voice pipe buzzed urgently. "Still no radar emissions, sir." Hasumu's report indicated that the vessel ahead, like most merchant ships at that stage of the war, had no radar. I-357's stealthy approach from astern on a dark night could only be detected visually. What was not good was the storm. The closer it came, the more likely it was that lightning flashes might reveal the presence of the submarine. For that reason, a submerged attack would have been better. Yashimoto, however, had no intention of using his remaining torpedoes on a merchant ship. Their target would be the aircraft carrier. The ship ahead had to be sunk by gunfire, the sooner the better. He called the hydrophone cabinet. "Range now? 1,200 yards, sir." It was the voice of the chief operator who had taken over. Yashimoto spoke to the first lieutenant by voice pipe. "Gun action stations," he commanded. Soon afterwards, the gun hatch below the foreside of the bridge opened, and the crew of I-357's 4-inch moved silently to their stations on the forward platform. To no one's surprise, for he had excellent night vision, it was Yashimoto who first saw the blurred shape ahead at about the time the hydrophone operator reported the range to be 500 yards. "I see it," the captain exclaimed to the gunnery officer beside him. "It is dead ahead. Open fire when the range is down to 300 yards. Aim at the wireless cabin. It is abaft the funnel. We do not want them transmitting an SSSS signal. After that, go for their stern gun." SSSS was the emergency code for attacked by submarine. Toshida passed the range and bearing to the gun's crew. "Stand by for the order to open fire," he said. "When I give it, aim abaft the funnel. Knock out that wireless cabin." To the captain he said, "I have got it, sir. Can't make out any detail, just a vague shape." He spoke without lowering his binoculars. A flash of sheet lightning revealed for an instant the lumbering bulk of a cargo steamer ahead, smoke pouring from its funnel. In that brief glimpse, those on the submarine's bridge saw no signs of life round the freighter's stern gun. A rumble of thunder was followed by large single drops of rain which began to beat a wet tattoo on the bridge. "Liberty ship," snapped Yashimoto. "Range 350, sir," came from the hydrophone cabinet. There was thinly concealed excitement in the operator's voice. Yashimoto touched the gunnery officer's arm. "Range 350. Open fire when you are ready." He swore softly as the rain began to fall more heavily, misting the lenses of his binoculars. Another sheet of lightning was followed by a roll of thunder. It seemed to those on the bridge that a long time elapsed before Toshida's voice broke the silence with the long-expected order to open fire. The flash and report of the 4-inch gun sounded mute and inadequate after the more violent manifestations of the storm. With the shell whining its way across the water, Yashimoto waited, tense, keyed up, watching the dim shape ahead as best he could through rain-streaked binoculars. A faint white plume in the darkness marked the shell's fall short of the target. 3 more rounds were fired before a burst of flame erupted from the midship superstructure of the Liberty ship. "Get more hits abaft the funnel," demanded Yashimoto. "Then knock out the stern gun." He spoke into the voice pipe. "Revolutions for 8 knots." Turning to the coxswain, he said, "Steer 20 degrees to starboard." Though the gunnery of defensively armed merchant ships was notoriously indifferent, and a trimmed-down submarine a difficult target, especially at night, Yashimoto had no intention of getting too close. With the range under 300 yards and still closing, he brought I-357's bows round to starboard, reducing speed to maintain distance from the enemy ship. It had become a more visible target now, the shell having started a fire amidships. With the submarine falling off to starboard, the barrel of its 4-inch gun swung to port, holding the steamer steady in the gun sight. This was happening so swiftly that within less than a minute of the first hit, 3 more rounds had been fired, the first splashing to starboard of the freighter, the next 2 exploding on the superstructure abaft the funnel. A new sound broke into the night, the shrill hiss of escaping steam. A white plume, illuminated by the light from the fire, reached up from the Liberty ship's funnel. Lightning flashed once again, and for the first time men could be seen round the freighter's gun, its barrel trained on the submarine. "Shift target to stern gun!" Yashimoto's shout was urgent. There was a clap of thunder, rain sluiced down, and in that moment an orange flash came from the enemy's gun. A shell screeched towards I-357 and splashed into the sea beyond. "Port 20!" shouted Yashimoto. It was vital to present a smaller target. The submarine's sudden alteration of course, immediately after the unexpected arrival of the freighter's shell, combined to confuse I-357's gun crew, their next 2 rounds falling well astern of the target. Toshida's shouted corrections were drowned by another shell splash, this time raising a column of white water just short of I-357's turning bows. It required several more rounds from the submarine before one exploded on the Liberty ship's stern in a vivid sheet of flame. Despite the light from the fire amidships, it was too dark to see what damage had been done, though it was soon evident that the stern gun had been silenced.